What is up, Packer fans? Welcome into a brand new edition of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. No news, no notes, just our main topic today. So let's get started right away. Today's topic is going to be kind of the core of this Packers roster for 2023 in some way. What I wanted to try to do is go over this roster with, as Matt LaFleur said, a fine-tooth comb. And I wanted to identify the players that I thought for sure, no question about it, lead pipe lock, are going to be on the 53-man roster in 2023. So come hell or high water, no matter what happens, these will be sort of the core of your team that we know as of today are going to be competing for the Green Bay Packers in some capacity in 2023. Now, a couple quick caveats here. I'm not including, like, an injury could happen, a suspension could happen, those sort of things could happen between now and then, and those things are just impossible to foresee, right? Number two, there's always something crazy that could happen. For example, if, some team called and offered a crazy draft compensation package for TJ Slayton, let's say. Okay, like if some team calls tomorrow, I was like, hey, we want to offer a first and a third for TJ Slayton. I'm sorry, I couldn't see that coming, and nor do I think that's going to happen, but there's always something crazy that could happen. If we take all the completely unrealistic possibilities out of the equation, this is the core group that I think will be for sure, no question about it, a part of the 2023 53-man roster. Now, one other thing. This isn't extremely likely. This isn't, likely. This isn't probably. This is for sure. For sure will be on the 53-man roster. So you could make arguments of hey, X player, I really I really think they're going to be on the roster. I might too. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily a lead pipe lock to make the team. So I actually posted my 20 players on Twitter yesterday that I think are lead pipe locks to make the team. I am making one change to that list today. I am eliminating one name. I will get to that name in just a moment, but I'll actually start by giving you my 19 names. And no, this wasn't an initial all right, I wasn't trying to make a listicle of being all right, who are my 20 players who are going to be lead pipe locks for the season? It wasn't it. I just literally went down the roster and I'm looking at the contracts and saying which of these players for sure will be on the roster in 2020. It could have been 7, it could have been 40, it could have been any number. It just happened that it was 20, and now I'm actually cutting that down to 19, which I'll explain in a second. So here are my 19 players that I think are lead pipe locks for the 2023 Green Bay Packers roster. So here we go. Running back, A.J. Dillon. Wide receiver, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. H-back/tight end, Josiah DeGuara. Offensive line, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr., Yosh Nijman, and Zach Tom. Defensive linemen, Kenny Clark, Devondre Wyatt, and TJ Slayton. Or Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton. Linebackers, Devondre Campbell and Quay Walker. Edge rushers, Rashawn Gary and Kingsley Enagbare. Easy for me to say today. Corners, Jair Alexander and Eric Stokes. And safety, Darnell Savage. I'm going to read that one more time since I butchered half the names. A.J. Dillon at running back, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs at wide receiver, DeGuara at H-back tight end, offensive line, Jenkins, Myers, Runyon, Nijman, Tom, defensive lineman, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, linebackers, Devondre Campbell and Quay Walker, edge rushers, Rashawn Gary and Kingsley Enagbare, corners, Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, and safety, Darnell Savage. The one player that I had on my list yesterday that I do not have on my list today is Rasool Douglas. I think he is very likely to maybe even extremely likely. I will get to why I changed it more in just a moment. He was initially on my list of 20. I don't have him on the list of 19 today. Like I said, we'll go over why in just a second. So I think the easiest way to go through this is to go position by position. And I'm not going to make a huge thing out of it. I just want to go and kind of give my reasoning why on each of the spots. So let's start with quarterback, which you may have noticed did not have any listed. I know you are upset that Danny Etling didn't make my list, but let's talk quickly about Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. There's just scenarios where both of them could, not both together, but either of them could not be on the roster this upcoming season. The Aaron Rodgers scenario is obvious. Either he, and we went through it completely yesterday. If you didn't check out that episode, I highly recommend it. The whole contract for Aaron Rodgers. but he could legitimately retire. And maybe that's an extremely unlikely scenario in your mind. It's still like the door is open for him to do that. And then there could be a request for a trade, or Green Bay could decide to go in another direction. There are multiverses in which those things happen. So we can't say Rodgers is a lead pipe lock. I think he's likely to come back. I wouldn't even say very likely. I wouldn't say extremely likely. I would say likely, but there's an avenue where he doesn't come back. So you can't put him as a lead pipe lock. Jordan Love, also, I would say more like very likely he's back, maybe even extremely likely, but you could make an argument that Jordan Love's camp says, hey, if Rodgers is back and this thing's just going to keep going, we need to go to a spot where we can compete, and he could demand a trade in. Green Bay could acquiesce and say, yeah, we're going to trade you, we'll get you to another team, and we're going to bring somebody else in that can maybe help Aaron win this year, because they don't have a ton of avenues to add talent to this roster next year if they are going to try to go all in again. Free agency is not going to be a great avenue, so they might have to get a little bit creative. That could include trading Jordan Love if that situation would arise. So I do think there are possibilities that either could not be on the roster in 2023. I think one of them will be almost entirely for sure. I can't imagine a scenario where both Love and Rodgers aren't on the roster, but it's tough to say either of them are a lead pipe lock because of what we just went over. So no quarterbacks are lead pipe locks on my list. The one I got asked about a decent amount as well was Aaron Jones. Reminder that, in my opinion, there's three ways that Green Bay can go this offseason. They can go to reboot this team, basically try to run it back again, and make a couple tweaks to make them competitive again next year, hoping that they revert back to 2020 or 2021 form when they had opportunities to win it. They could do sort of like a status quo where we're not going to borrow a bunch from the future. We're not going to, retain all of our guys. We're going to maybe keep Aaron Rodgers and maybe a Bakhtiari and an Aaron Jones, but we're not going to go all in and get crazy. We need to start getting our salary cap a little bit under control. Or we could do a rip the Band-Aid mode where we're just going to nuke as many contracts as we could possibly nuke. And we know we need to get younger. It's time to say goodbye to Aaron. It's time to say hello to Jordan. And with that becomes a significant youth movement. So there's three different avenues. There's a couple slight minor ones that could go, like, for example, the middle ground could also be a Jordan Love, but you bring back a Bakhtiari and a Aaron Jones to make that transition a little cleaner, a little smoother. There's some things like that could happen, but basically kind of an all-in, a middle ground, or a rip the Band-Aid. Those are your sort of three different options. And if they would go the rip the Band-Aid option, Aaron Jones probably without a home. Even if they go in some of the middle ground options, Aaron Jones could be without a home in Green Bay. And meaning here, he would have potentially up to $16 million in savings if he was cut or traded post June 1st. So if this is a team that all of a sudden decides that it wants to get under the salary cap, or if they decide, hey, we don't think that Aaron is, paying Aaron Jones that much money, even with restructures and things like that, is the best way to build out this roster. We think we can get by with an A.J. Dillon and maybe like a third round pick or something like that at running back. Maybe they go in a different direction. I think it's likely to, maybe even very likely that he's back. But I do think there's scenarios out there where Aaron Jones could not be a part of this roster, specifically if they would go more of a rip the Band-Aid option. So I can't say with certainty that Aaron will be back. And when he has that much cap savings, usually if there are surprising releases, it's because of salary cap reasons. And that would exactly be, if it did come to fruition, what would be happening with Aaron Jones there, that they would just feel like, hey, from a salary cap standpoint, we feel like we could use this money better elsewhere. It's no disrespect to Aaron. We love Aaron, but there's only a finite amount of resources that we can use. Or again, they're ripping the Band-Aid off. So I don't think Aaron Jones can be a lead pipe lock for that reason. I did get some questions on why A.J. Dillon was a lock. He's on the last year of his deal. It's a very small deal. He's not going anywhere. He was a second round pick, and it's just, he is a lead pipe lock for sure. Wide receiver, Alan Lazard and Randall Cobb are both going to be free agents. Randall Cobb's contract will void, making him a free agent. Alan Lazard is just a true unrestricted free agent. And then I mentioned Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs are lead pipe locks, clearly. And then the other one that was extremely close to just insanely likely, in my opinion, is Samori Toure. I very much toyed with putting him on the locks list. The reason I think he could be is, first of all, as a 7th round pick, he showed a lot of promise this season. Not a ton, like he didn't get that much playing time, but he showed promise when he was actually able to get in the game. Secondly, both Brian Gutekunst and Matt LaFleur brought him up unprompted in press conferences recently of how they feel like he can be a part of this wide receiving core moving forward. That goes a long way. And even more importantly, right now your only two locks at receiver are Dobbs and Watson. Lazard probably not back. Cobb probably tied to Aaron Rodgers. Even if Cobb is back, you probably have the two wide receivers in Cobb. And then you've got three wide receiver spots to fill. I think, again, the odds that Toure isn't one of those as like your sixth receiver is extremely slim. The only reason I would say not is, let's say Green Bay does run it back, right? And you bring back Randall Cobb and somehow Rodgers fights to get Lazard back. You've got Dobbs and Watson. They bring in, they draft another receiver early. And all of a sudden, that's five guys that are locks. And now you've got a number 6 wide receiver spot. And what if Toure comes to camp and just doesn't do anything? Like, we remember, like, he's a 7th round pick, right? There's nothing guaranteed about him on the roster, just inherently. I think he will get there. Like I said, I think it's extremely likely. But if he all of a sudden comes to training camp, doesn't do anything in camp, doesn't do anything in preseason, and just looks kind of average, there's a possibility that if they have enough receivers on the roster and guys just look better, he could get beat out. Do I think it's likely? No, I think he's probably on the roster, but I just couldn't quite put that lead pipe lock on Samori Toure. And as mentioned, Lazard, Cobb, both free agents, Watson, Dobbs, I have in my lead pipe locks. All right, tight end, Josiah DeGuara, I did get some questions of like, well, all right, why did he get on? Well, he's got a $1.3 million cap hit in the last year of his deal. And the savings, if you would release him, would be about 1.1 million, but you're going to pay about 800,000 to anyone that's replacing him. So you basically save 300K for moving on from Josiah DeGuara. I just think he's a guy that's been in the system now for a while. He's found his role. I don't think they're going to go out of their way to find another H-back / fullback type player. I think they've kind of got their guy now. I think when this is going to be a team that needs cheap young players that can fill roles on the team, that can play special teams, and Josiah DeGuara does all of that, right? And I think there's still untapped potential with him as well. So can't really see a scenario where he's not on the team, and just especially with the salary cap hit that he's at, there's just no downside to keeping him. So that's why he's on my list. And then the other part is that there's no other tight ends that you can say are lead pipe locks. Certainly not Tyler Davis. Mercedes Lewis is a free agent, probably maybe tied to Aaron Rodgers. Maybe he just retires. That's a possibility as well. And then Robert Tonyan is a unrestricted free agent as well and didn't have the season. I know he's coming off a torn ACL, but didn't really have the season I think a lot we're hoping for. Did show promise towards the end of the year that maybe he was recovering from his ACL, but I still think that one can't be put in the lock category just inherently because he's an unrestricted free agent. So DeGuara is my only one there. As we get to offensive line, again, as mentioned, Jenkins, Myers, Runyon, Nyman, and Tom are my locks. I think Tom and, Jenkins, Myers, very clear. I had somebody ask about John Runyon Jr. He's on a 1-year, $1 million deal, basically, remaining on his contract. Like, he is a starter, a good starter. There's no way, in any way, shape, or form, you are letting John Runyon Jr. go when he has that type of deal. So he is a lock as well. Yash Nyman was the one I got a lot of questions on as well. So remember here that Yash is a restricted free agent. I think this one just plays out far too easily for any other scenario to happen. There's one scenario that maybe plays out where he doesn't end up a Packer, but basically Green Bay has to start by making a decision with Yash of, are they going to put a 2nd round tender on him, or are they going to put a right of first refusal? If they put a right of first refusal on him, it would be a 1-year, $2.6 million qualifying offer, but any other team could sign him to an offer sheet. Green Bay would have the ability to match, but if any team signed him to a legitimate deal, Green Bay probably wouldn't be able to match it just based on where they're at from a salary cap standpoint. Because of that, I don't think they want to lose him, and I do think he is a legitimate swing to starting, like, if he's a starting guy, he's your 5th guy, right? But like, he's a good swing tackle, and there's value in that. And he still does show the ability, I think, to get better. And I do think there's still some growth there for Yash as well. The 2nd round tender is a 1-year, $4.3 million deal. That's probably, I don't know, like, people will come out on two very opposite sides. I had people on Twitter saying, no, you need to move on from Yash Nyman. Like, don't bring him back at all. I saw others be like, hey, teams might give him a 2nd round pick and sign him to a long-term deal. All right. That's not happening. I do think that if they do a right of first refusal, that some team could bring him in as a starting offensive lineman. I don't think Green Bay goes in that direction. I think they put a second round tender on him. I think they bring him back in the 1 year, $4.3 million deal. Maybe they eventually do some restructures to that to get it a little bit lower and have some of those cap hits in future seasons. But I just think he's too important as a swing player on this offensive line to not bring back. And because of that, there's no chance, and I mean 0% chance, that some team gives up a second round pick and gives him a huge free agent contract. So as soon as they put the second round tender on him, he's locked in. He's not going anywhere. Nobody's giving up a second round pick for Yosh Nijman. So that's why I have him on my lock list. If he does get the right of first refusal, that opens up a different can of worms that I would be willing to say then that things are more up in the air. I just really don't think Green Bay goes in that direction. So that's why I have Yosh on my list as well. You might be asking about David Bakhtiari. I think Bakhtiari at this point is likely to be back. And even almost, if they go rip the Band-Aid, it's really, really hard. But yeah, almost no matter what, I think he's likely to be back. I just think he's too good of a player. And I think you bring that type of player back as many times as you can because he's David Bakhtiari and he's just that good. That being said, that injury risk is legitimate. And a GM's job is to constantly weigh risk reward. And there is a very big red flag on his knee. And there's a very, very big risk with David Bakhtiari. If Green Bay just deems that that risk is too large, regardless of how great he is still, Green Bay might say, we can't take that risk. We know that if we, bring him back next year, we're going to be paying a significant amount of money for a player who we don't even know if he's going to be able to make it through the season. And you could say that about every player, but it's obviously different and there's more risk for David Bakhtiari. So I think he's back. I think it's very likely that he's back, but I can't put a full stamp of approval to say no matter what, he is back. They're going to do, I'm sure, physical testing on him, medical testing on him, reviewing the knee. And if they get something back on the medicals that they're scared about, they would go in a different direction. And I do think if they do ultimately decide to go a rip the Band-Aid route, which I should say I don't think is very likely at all. That just is not the way that this team operates. But if they would go that direction, then they would have a very significant reason to maybe go in a different direction as well. So likely back, but I can't put him just inherently because of the injury issues and because of the risk involved. And knowing how GMs think, I can't put him in the lead pipe lock category. So Caleb Jones, Rasheed Walker, Royce Newman, those guys I can't also, they will have to earn their jobs in training camp. Sean Ryan's the really interesting one. Third round pick just this past year, coming off a suspension, looked bad in camp, was never in contention for any of the even game day roster spots, much less a starting spot. It has not looked promising, and then he gets a 4-game suspension at the end of the year. If he comes into camp and does looks the same and just doesn't put any effort towards it and is still just blah, I think he probably still makes it, probably off of his third round selection. And I would say extremely likely, almost no matter what. But this has gone off to a very bad start, including the suspension. And if there's any issues, any off-field anything, any just doesn't come into, camp in good shape, that would be a major red flag. And a part of me does think that with all the offensive linemen on this roster, that Sean Ryan would have to go out and earn the job. That would be really ugly if they had to cut another third round pick this early. But just based on how bad this season was for Ryan, I just struggle to put him quite in that lock. He's going to be back. He's going to be on the roster, but I just can't lock it in. So you could argue Sean Ryan could be on the list, but you wouldn't be super excited about putting him on the list anyway. Let's just put it that way. So not quite there yet with Sean Ryan. All right, that wraps up offense. Let's go to defense really quick. Defensive linemen, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, all locks to me. I can't imagine. Clark's not going anywhere. Devontae was just a first-round pick. And Slayton, he's shown way too much potential. So those three guys locked in. Jerron Reed is a free agent, and Jonathan Ford's a 7th-round pick. So that one's very inherently easy. Edge rusher, Rashawn Gary back, Kingsley Enagbare back. You're not quite, Jonathan Garvin and Justin Holland's a free agent. Garvin, whatever, you're not worried about those guys. The big question comes with Preston Smith. Sort of same thing as Bakhtiari, that if they go a rip the Band-Aid route, that they would have a potential up to $10.6 million in savings if they did a June 1st release. And, Smith was up and down this year. There were times he looked really good. There were times he was completely disappeared, including really against the Lions. Didn't do anything in that game. So if they go young and knowing that they're getting Gary back and have Enigbari on the other side, that looked good his rookie year, I could see them going in a different direction. I think it's likely he's back. Not very likely, but I think it's likely he's back. But anytime you have a potential savings of $10 million plus for a team that's struggling with salary cap issues, it's a legitimate possibility that they could go in a different direction. So that's why Preston Smith did not make my lock list. Inside linebacker, Quay Walker, obviously back. And then you've got Devondre Campbell. The cap hit's just too big. Like the out year, maybe next year, certainly the following year, but just based on him signing the new deal, like just the dead cap is far too much to outweigh anything. And he didn't have the year he had, in 2021, but he wasn't awful either. Like he was fine. So I don't think he's going anywhere, mostly based on his contract situation. There's just not enough upside to releasing him. So he'll be back. I had questions about Isaiah McDuffie. Really nice player, core special teams guy. Showed out well when he was at inside linebacker. Certainly a favorite probably to make one of those backup inside linebacker spots. But anytime you're Isaiah McDuffie and you're not a starter, you have to go and earn your job in training camp. So can't lock it in, but I like Isaiah McDuffie. I think he's probably on the team, but that's as far as I would go. I certainly wouldn't lock him in. Corner, Jair in, Stokes in. Jair just signed his deal. Stokes is still in his rookie deal, first round pick. Those ones are locks. You could argue, could Stokes have a situation where he couldn't start the season on the 53 because he's still recovering from injury? If you wanted to make that argument, okay, fine. I don't know the extent and just how bad his injury was. So maybe there's a chance he could start on the PUP list. He'll be on the 53 at some point next year is what I'm saying here. Rasool Douglas was the interesting one. I had him on my lock list. Ultimately, the question that you have to ask is, would you sign, if you had the choice today, would you sign Rasool Douglas to a 1-year, $5 million deal? If your answer is yes, then you bring him back. If the answer is no, then you release him. I think it's very likely that Rasool is back. I think he played better than most people thought. He wasn't same as Devondre, wasn't good as a season ago. The difference with Devondre is that they legitimately can get out of this deal. In a rip the Band-Aid situation, they probably move on. And if they maybe just thought like, hey, he's an outside corner and Stokes and Jair are outside corners, and we'd rather have that money to re-sign a Keyshawn Nixon and maybe have him play in the slot and be our kick returner, maybe they could go in a different direction. I think it's likely that he's back, to very likely to maybe even extremely likely. But there is a small sliver that as I looked at his contract more and just thought about it more, I'm just like, there is an out there, and if they do decide to make some changes, there's a slight possibility that they could move on from him. So he was on my initial 20. Him and Toure would be like the next two that I think are the most likely to be on the roster, but I just couldn't put him quite in the guarantee list. So that's where I'm at with Rasool. Keyshawn Nixon, I'm sure that they are going to do everything they can to retain his services, but he's an unrestricted free agent. He played well in the slot, and he's now one of the best kick returners in all of football, if not the best kick returners in all of football. Dude got paid, and this is a team that doesn't have a ton of free agent money, and they're now going to have to fight for his services. You can't franchise tag him as a cornerback. You can't even transition tag him because his agent would sign that so insanely quick. So you just got to fight teams off in free agency, and that can inherently become a problem. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of Keyshawn. It's some team with a ton of money. Chicago Bears says like, hey, we want Keyshawn Nixon on our team. They can outbid the Packers every day of the week. They've got boatloads and boatloads of money. So if any team wants to outbid Green Bay, they can. And that could legitimately happen. So I would love Keyshawn back. I think you would love Keyshawn back. I think everyone would love Keyshawn back. But when you're an unrestricted free agent, you're free game. And that's why I can't put him in my guaranteed list. Safety, Rudy Ford's a free agent. Amos's contract voids, making him a free agent. And then Darnell Savage, well, I think Green Bay would probably like to move on, has a fully guaranteed deal. The only way you get off of that is by trading him. And his contract, if traded, would be fully traded to the other team. There's nothing that Green Bay would pay. It's all base salary guaranteed. I just don't think any team's taking that on. And if Green Bay wanted to go in that direction, they'd probably have to attach something to him for another team to take him on. And I do think he played slightly better towards the end of the year at safety and slot corner to show just enough to be like, it's not worth us to attach a pick to him, and therefore we're just going to keep him on his salary for the year. They could try to restructure, like do a contract extension with him, which is not a great idea either. But either way, I think Savage is back on this team, and just based on his guaranteed deal, I think that's a guarantee as well. Then you've got special teams players. Mason Crosby's a void contract, which becomes a free agent, unrestricted free agent. And then he also could just retire. So that's a possibility. Jack Coco was just bad. He wasn't good enough, to be quite frank. And then Pat O'Donnell, he is 32 years old. He was Pro Football Focus's 27th rated punter. If you just look at the punting stats, he's towards the bottom of the league. Part of that's punting at Lambeau, I get that. But he's what I would consider, and no disrespect, but he's a mediocre punter who's 32 years old, who you have a $1.9 million savings on if you release him. There's no lock for him to make the roster. And at best for Pat O'Donnell, they will bring in an undrafted free agent, or this is best case scenario for O'Donnell. They will bring in competition for him. And if the other punter punts better, they'll get the job. So he's nowhere near a lock to make this roster at all, even though he's a really great holder and he had some ups this season. He also didn't, like I say, he's this average. And if you've got a 32-year-old average punter that you can save money on, you're probably going to take a chance maybe with somewhere else, especially if you're trying to rebuild this team, which, again, Green Bay might do. Dallin Leavitt also has a special teamer. I know people were asking about him. I think he and Rich Bisaccia might very well be tied at the hip, and I think there's a really, really good chance that Green Bay signs him back on another vet minimum deal. But anytime you're an unrestricted free agent, I just have a hard time putting a lock on it. So that's why he is not a lock as well. So just to recap one more time, my 19 players that I think are lead pipe locks to make this team in 2023, A.J. Dillon, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Josiah DeGuara, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr., Yosh Nijman, Zach Tom, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, Rashawn Gary, JJ Nigbari, Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, and Darnell Savage. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you haven't yet, please make sure to subscribe, like, comment. Just really appreciate you guys joining me to do this. This is always so fun. And off season is, I know it's not playoffs, but kicking this stuff off and going over who's going to be here, free agents, draft, it's two totally different seasons, and I love both of them in two totally different ways. But this is a really fun aspect of just seeing how this roster is going to get put together, and Green Bay's in a really, really unique spot where their roster could go in a variety of different directions. And it's like I've said before, this is going to be a franchise-altering offseason for Green Bay in some capacity. So join me tomorrow. I'll be right back here. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.